Dr. Regina Hamilton is an assistant professor in the English department and the African American and African Studies program at the University of Kentucky. Her research interests include the 20th and 21st century African American literature and African American women's literature. Her current project focuses on the use of speculative literary devices by authors of African American literature throughout the 20th century. Much more than a marginal subgenre, speculative literature is one of the central literary mechanisms within the African American literary canon. Regina's research delves more deeply into why that is the case and how authors of African American literature have used speculative literary devices to envision futures beyond anti-Blackness. Please welcome Dr. Regina Hamilton-Townsend.
Hello, 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 hello. I am sorry I am not with you there in Maine. You know I would be if I could. Happy 2023 Readers Retreat. It is good to be with you again this year. I'm about 9 months pregnant, so I can travel. So definitely eat, drink, and be merry in the absence of my physical presence, but know I'm with you in spirit. Hello again to my Zoom crew. We've been having a very good time on Zoom this morning, and I'm glad to be in the digital space with you. Also, I would like to say that it is an interesting and really, I'm honored actually to be able to talk about River Solomon's and the kindness of ghosts with them in the room. I've never done that before. I had a close call with Samuel Delaney one time, and I'm glad I didn't because I was like the one scholar like kind of pinning his book down on some things. So Rivers, I hope you enjoy what I have to say. All right, let's get going. Okay, so as you all know, we are engaging the amazing River Solomon's text, An Unkindness of Ghosts, this year. And if you were here last year, you know I may have had a small hand in encouraging a few voters to vote for this text because it's one of my favorite books. And I think it's one of the best texts written in the 21st century. And In Kindness of Ghosts is a book of contradictions. It manages to look backwards and forward simultaneously. More about that later. It gives its readers an expansive universe while also depicting the restriction, surveillance, and suffocation of living on the Matilda as it hurtles through space, supposedly away from Earth at first. It showcases a brave new world while also depicting how human beings are loath to give up their prejudices and their power relations, often to their unrelenting detriment. But the thing that always fascinated me about this book is that though human society has regressed to monarchies and slavery and extreme forms of segregation, in this book, in this story, all of these things, all of the violence and the slave, and the hierarchies finally come to an end. And this is where I want to start. Okay, so for those of you who were here last year, I like to give you cues for when we are through a section. Okay, so we are officially through the introduction to this talk. Congrats to you that you've made it this far. Hopefully you are still vibing with me. Okay, so there are a couple sections. I am definitely going to make sure we have time to discuss after this. I'm not going to use this whole time to just yammer on. I want to talk to all of you. And so I'm going to not talk as long as I maybe normally would have. So I hope you guys have a lot of questions ready. And I want to frame this next section a little bit for you. So again, my specialty is African American literature of the 20th and 21st century. My specialty is Black speculative fiction. And so I wrote a piece of my dissertation on An Unkindness of Ghosts. So I've been writing about this book probably since it came out. And I pulled a little bit of that for this talk. But I also want to say that I'm this piece of my talk and of my dissertation was about me sort of using a nascent attempt at using an unkindness of ghosts to sort of push the formal elements of the neo-slave narrative into the future. And to do that in this version of it, I was trying to prove, right, to myself and my committee and my readers that I see the unkindness of ghosts as a kind of neo-slave narrative. And as a more seasoned scholar, I think that was a good start, but I think that I am more interested in what that says about the neo-slave narrative genre, whether like in what ways the neo-slave genre may still be important and useful to 21st century readers. What happens to you when you take the neo-slave genre to space? And all these other kinds of questions, right? And so I will be engaging a little bit of all of that in this section. I just kind of wanted to frame that for you so it didn't feel like it came out of nowhere. So I'm going to read this and I'm going to come up for air again at the end of this section, and we'll only have one more section to go. All right, let's do this. So I called this section Space and the Slave Narrative, but that was not its original title. I called this section of my dissertation on an unkindness of ghosts, Ghosts in the Machine, which I still love that title. And I'm trying to figure out a way to get that back into my book. And Ghost in the Machine was a reference to Astor's mother, Loon, and all of the ways that she directs the action as a kind of spectral presence in the text. But there are more ghosts in the machine. And formally, the ghosts in the machine are the genres of the slave and neo-slave narrative. It's also interesting that in this piece that I'm writing, I was focusing at the time on Blackness going to space and what that meant for Blackness, right? And I hit upon two sort of spacefaring texts that at the very least play with slave narrative themes if they are not, entire slave narratives themselves, right? Isaiah Lavender, who I argue a little bit with in this piece, discusses his idea of the neo-slave narrative and meta-narratives in terms of the interplay between the past, present, and the future. And I definitely think that In the Kindness of Ghosts does that. So as authors like River Solomon imagine Blackness, Black people, Black futures, away from the various nations that they exist in, and from the earth more broadly, it remains imperative to discuss how white supremacy is a plague that will follow us out into, through, and beyond the universe itself. And so here's a quote really quickly by Jana Brown, who says, quote, "There are meanings historically bound to Black diasporan subjects that explain this. Slavery and colonization were post-apocalyptic, and Black people's existence across the globe continues as a condition of alienation. And this alienation tied to Black bodies follows our species out into space, and Black authors use this to make critiques. And then maybe this explains some of the intense connection between the post-apocalyptic dystopia and the slave narrative." Okay, so I wanted to pull up for air a little bit here and say that I find that the books in the series that deal with this sort of futuristic elements of what could be considered a slave narrative are, of course, In the Kindness of Ghosts, but I also discussed the Xenogenesis series by Octavia Butler in the same chapter. And I often write about those two, like the Xenogenesis series, which is, let's see, my brain will work right now. Pregnancy brain, not a great time. Dawn, Adulthood Rights, and Imago. I think that's right. And so this next paragraph that I'm going to read is sort of indicative of the way that I often conceptualize these texts together, and of the idea that, this is an important stream of neo-slave narratives that needs to be discussed, right? Okay. And so breaking out of my An Unkindness of Ghosts text, I write this. Themes of human enslavement and sexual coercion are central to each of the 3 texts in the Xenogenesis series by Octavia Butler. Yet when scholars discuss neo-slave narratives in relation to Butler's work, Xenogenesis is not mentioned as often as other texts of Butler's oeuvre, such as Kindred or Wild Seed, which we read last year. The presence of extraterrestrials and what seems like the impending doom of the entire human species instead of a particular subset seems often to ally the inclusion of this series in many conversations about neo-slave narratives. Jeffrey Tucker argues that there are real limits to reading Xenogenesis as a slave narrative, although there is an anti-colonialist approach to the human side of Butler's contact narratives. The author's aliens are not necessarily figures for white slave owners and overseers, end quote. Tucker cites the, quote, biological compulsion of the Oankali, the aliens, right, to breed as somehow more noble than lust or greed when it is related to both. Yet even Tucker has to admit that despite the limitations of the slavery hypothesis, race still matters in Xenogenesis. On the other side of the issue, Mari Dube argues that, quote, neo-slave narratives are impelled by the conviction that the racial legacy of slavery has not yet become a matter of history. Butler obviously shares this conviction. Extended realist references to this history appear throughout her fiction, revealing the afterlife of the construction of race instituted by U.S. chattel slavery. Another scholar, Lisa Dotto, argues that, quote, it's important to recognize that the symbiotic relationship between Lilith and the Oankali is not only a form of oppression, but also the only means of resistance available to humans within the racialized structures of the reimagined colonial system, historically epitomized by slavery. Okay. So that's a little bit, there was one question I think in the chat about, you know, maybe some similarities between Solomon's work and Butler's work. And I think that An Unkindness of Ghosts and thinking about formal elements of like what I call in some cases like a futuristic neo-slave narrative is maybe one place where we could have a little bit of that conversation. All right. So Isaiah Lavender expands the idea of neo-slave narratives to include his idea of meta-slavery narratives. Meta-slavery narratives are a science fiction version of the neo-slave narrative, where, quote, science fiction writers work out complicated feelings toward the peculiar institution by creating representations of the historical events of slavery, charging their retellings of the past with their own rationality and truth, making them vivid and unflinching accounts of evil in their attempt to come to some kind of closure with fabulous impulses, end quote. Lavender argues that, quote, issues of meta-slavery occur in Butler's Xenogenesis trilogy. Butler uses meta-slavery to explicitly reawaken the unbearable memory of slavery. And then he goes on to argue that as the epitome of racism, then, slavery is the inevitable starting point of any exploration of race in science fiction. I don't know how I feel about that, but I argue with him about it quite a bit. Okay, and for the field of science fiction, this may be true, but from within African-American literature, where I locate myself in my work, this is not the case. However, it is true that the neo-slave narrative form does offer something useful and specific to authors of African-American literature like Butler and like Solomon. And we're going to talk more a little bit about that later. All right. And so in An Unkindness of Ghosts, the protagonist, 25-year-old Aster, may not know much, if anything, about the history of humans before the spaceship Matilda and its inhabitants fled from Earth. And she is definitely unclear about how that history is connected to her personally. Aster is still searching for information about her own personal past, and it is her relationship with the texts her mother left behind that help Aster solve the mystery of her mother's death. The people aboard the Matilda have been on the spaceship for almost 400 years, flying at light speed, for most of it, toward a promised land that does not exist. The knowledge that there is no habitable planet, no specific safe port that they are heading toward is just one of many pieces of knowledge that Aster's mother Lune leaves encoded in the maps and cryptic journals she leaves behind. The idea that the Matilda is just careening aimlessly into space with no real bearing is radical enough to inspire Loon to act. The only idea more radical is Loon's plan to change that course by using a black hole to turn the giant ship back toward Earth, or the Great Lighthouse, as Matildans call it. It is Loon's one act of resistance setting the ship toward the known point from which it came that cost Loon her life and also reveals the guiding principle of the text that sometimes humans need to go back to move forward. And then Loon dies shortly after giving birth to Aster, and Aster is haunted by both by Loon's presence and her absence as she goes about her life aboard the Matilda. And so I argued at least in this paper, I'm trying to decide if I want to continue to argue this at least. I argue that there are two kinds of neo-slave narratives: those that move characters to the past, like say Kindred, or Dessa Rose, or the Water Dancer, right? And those that move characters and enslavement to the future, like in The Kindness of Ghosts, I argue here. Isaiah Lavender draws a similar distinction when he separates neo-slave narratives from his idea of meta-slavery narratives. For Lavender, meta-slavery narratives attempt to situate slavery beyond its historical conventions, while relying on the resources that science fiction can bring to bear on Black experiences. So that's how he explains what that term means. According to Lavender, one of the resources that science fiction brings to the table is that, quote, we break away from the actual historical continuum when we read science fiction, going forward and back in time, experiencing alternative realities and an unfamiliar humanity, leaving us free to change our history, our society, and ourselves in our examination of its process, end quote. As my study has demonstrated, science fiction is not the only genre that allows the movement of characters and cultures through time and space. And the one thing that remains static in African-American literature is the history of African-American enslavement and its afterlives. Lavender argues that science fiction foregrounds undefined temporality and unfamiliar humanity, which makes his assertion that all African-American literature is science fiction even more untenable. When science fiction uses unfamiliar and undefined humanity to engage, quote, the living history of slavery, end quote, it is always the Black body that is left in the wake, as science fiction authors often choose to eschew that body and use robots, aliens, and technologically changed beings as proxies for the enslaved. From an African-American literary perspective, it is crucial that the connection between Black bodies and the history of African-American enslavement is never diminished in ways that obfuscate the realities of Black life in America then and now. Okay, so one of the through lines in African-American literature then between slave narratives, neo-slave narratives, futuristic neo-slave narratives is an engagement with the Black body as it relates to the condition of being enslaved in various versions of the past and future. In The Unkindness of Ghosts, Aster and the other characters aboard Matilda are so far removed from notions of America, the institution of American enslavement, even from Earth itself, that they are completely unconscious of how anti-Blackness and socio-political realities of American slavery and its afterlives continue to affect the societal structure aboard the Matilda. That is to say, Aster and the other Matildans do not have to remember American enslavement from a millennia before for that institution to be still organizing the world around them in ways they cannot quite comprehend. Therefore, as much as Aster is haunted personally by what is left behind of her mother's existence, the true ghost haunting this text is African-American enslavement and its tenacious and long-lasting afterlives. Even in this future so far removed, even from the contemporary moment of the early 21st century, anti-Blackness is the ghost in the socio-political machine of the Matilda as it hurtles away from Earth as fast as it can, as far as anyone knows, and away from a painful and problematic human past. So there are quite a few indisputable thematic elements in the kindness of ghosts that place it within the neo-slave narrative tradition. For example, like so many Black communities in the antebellum South, this is for unity. The various decks aboard the ship are isolated from each other. One would assume the reason for segregating large groups of people and cultures for hundreds of years would be to stave off insurrection and to perpetuate ideas of otherness and isolation, right? Just like it would be hard for an enslaved person to move from one plantation to the next without running into anybody, right? Astor, as the assistant to the Matilda Surgeon General Theo, is allowed a level of mobility that very few Matildans ever enjoy. As she travels to various decks, serving as physician to those in need, Astor notes the differences between decks, including knowledge of various technologies and languages. According to Astor, quote, it was Matilda's geography, she supposed. What people had known for 2 generations on our deck had yet to be discovered on V, and so on. 20,000 low deckers and almost half as many different ways of life. That was the nature of a ship divided by metal, language, and armed guards. Even in decks as linked as the Tarlands, information had a way of staying put, end quote. Aboard the Matilda, there are no nations recognized by the leader known as the sovereign, but Tarlanders, this is a quote, were the inhabitants of P, Q, R, S, and T decks. And it was as close to a nation as anything on Matilda. I think Rivers read that part as well. Okay. All of the Tarlanders are dark-skinned people charged with picking the crops that are used to feed the inhabitants of the Matilda. These people who reside in the lower decks have been described as sharecroppers by some scholars, which I didn't like that. I find it an incorrect description considering they are under control of an overseer and a militarized force, which I didn't even write that in here, but a militarized force, who is authorized to do them bodily harm if they do not make curfew or work too slowly. Sounds familiar, right? Sharecroppers technically own what they produce, even if they have to use most of that produce to pay various debts. And it had been a form of sort of like debt slavery. The individuals aboard the lower decks of Matilda own nothing except their very few personal effects, and they are doled out provisions by the guard, who can change and decrease them at any time. They are housed in bunks and verbally and physically abused by the guards posted at each entrance and exit. Aboard the Matilda, race is not only operative in the areas designated for people of color, but also serves to structure life for white and or more affluent citizens in the upper decks. Theo didn't have white skin, whitish, but not white, quote. It was close enough that plausible deniability had allowed him to keep his status when his true ancestry came to prominence during puberty. It says an upper deck father, a lower deck mother. Such children belonged, as Astor had heard a C deck woman once say, downstairs. In other words, the surgeon is a character that passes and who is afforded a life in the upper decks because he can do so. Moments when he talks about like keeping his hair cut close, right? So it won't curl, et cetera, et cetera. Like Real, the protagonist from Of One Blood by Pauline Hopkins, which was written in like 1902. So this is a deep cut. Theo would not have been able to pursue a medical career unless he passed as white. Even being the accepted and recognized son of the sovereign could have taken him only so far if he was not able to blend pseudo-seamlessly into the society of the upper decks. The sovereign and the militarized guard that keep order aboard the ship treat people from the lower decks as lesser beings and enact laws and policies that codify lower deckers as being less than human. Talk a little bit more about that later too. Lieutenant, who is second in command to the sovereign, well, lieutenant, he's, his whole real name is lieutenant, which is loud. And also Theo's uncle says of the lower deckers, quote, none of them are harmless. They are animals. And if it weren't for us bending them into some kind of shape, they'd live in complete chaos and sin, which is very, very similar to a lot of the things that slaveholders would say about what makes slavery and holding slaves a kind of like honorable thing to do, right? That, enslaved people would just completely fall into chaos, and that they were saving them as doing their good Christian duty, right? For the Guard and the other governmental leaders, bending people into shape includes systematically disallowing these individuals any bodily or sexual autonomy. In addition to being routinely raped and beaten by the Guards, low deck individuals, generally to be women, even though they might be born with any combination of sex organs, are entered into a forced breeding program. Also sounds very familiar, right? For Aster specifically, doctors examine her genitals and reproductive tract and determined she was one of the few females of this quote poorly racial stock capable of carrying offspring. They rated her fit to breed, like so many enslaved women before her and around her, right? Aster's body is seen as a tool of domination, and regardless of what she wants for herself, according to the sovereign and that stamp in the manifest, her only value is what she produces through her productive and reproductive labor. And that's the concept I get from Jennifer Morgan. She wrote this book a while ago called Laboring Women, and it was about the combination, right? The dual labor of women, of enslaved women, to have to, the productive labor, right, of like picking crops or tending children or whatever. And then also the reproductive labor of being forced to maintain a sort of like fairly regular reproduction of more slaves. Okay, let's see where I was. Okay, if it were not for Theo's intervention, Aster's sexuality and fertility would have been usurped by the state, perhaps in perpetuity. Okay. So that's reminders on my computer. Going wild. Okay. Notwithstanding the components of neo-slave narratives discussed above, perhaps the element of an unkindness of ghosts that is most connected to both slave narratives and neo-slave narratives is the Matildas' disconnection from their history, right? By the time we meet Aster, the Matilda has been flying away from Earth, as far as anyone knows, for 325 years, and there seems to have been some important fissures between the various histories that led to this point. Earth is the stuff of fables to all of the people who are still alive on the Matilda. In one scene, Solomon explains how T-deck people wore charcoal around their eyes to imitate the appearance of raccoons. They fashioned themselves, quote, after the scavenging animal, where they descended from a scavenging people, so they said. So they told themselves. So their stories went. This far from the past, no one could truly know their history. Similar to the way in which the transatlantic slave trade created a historical gulf from which there was no real return for those that were displaced or their descendants. So too, the residents of the Matilda share a similar sense of historical rupture in their separation from Earth, especially since no one aboard the spaceship in the novel's present is passing along stories about how and why the Matilda was forced to leave the home planet. Perhaps it is because so much knowledge about humanity and about the greater world that existed has been lost to history that Aster and others like her and Melusine, seem fixated on passing down what memories they still have to the next generation. Aster remembers A. Melusine saying, "You got to document. That's what our work is as women folk, memorating any way we can. Do you count yourself among us?" Right? And Aster answers in the affirmative as a small child. And A. Melusine says, "That's what I thought. You never know when a memory is going to save your life." It is in some sense necessary for Aster's survival aboard the Matilda for her to write herself into being by keeping a journal like her mother, especially once Lieutenant intensifies his campaign of terror against her. In her review of Stia Hartman's Lose Your Mother, Alexis Pauline Gumbs argues that, quote, what we know is only the means through which we ourselves are produced. History is not the only way to know. Our privileged sight of knowledge is what is written, which shows what has been preserved and what story, what story has been told and when. And in the case of slavery, what and who has been obliterated through prices in a logbook, history's erased, end quote. So in lieu of history, the Matildans have created myriad ways to know themselves and to pass that knowledge along. People from the lower decks do not usually own any books, and most do not have access to Matilda's archive. So they rely on myth, fable, etc., to pass on memories and information. Okay. Okay, I think I'm gonna skip some of this so we'll have some time. I just talk about the prominence of text. I started talking about memory and textuality, et cetera, et cetera. But I do want to get to some other things really quickly. So some conclusions, a little bit. I'm using this paper to think through a better version of this paper that I want to write for ASA. This conference is taking place. And the theme of that conference is solidarity. And how I started thinking about, solidarity as it related to the kindness of ghosts was that, solidarity is often deployed as something positive, but the subjugation and racial caste system created and perpetuated by the institution of American slavery require solidarities as well. Most communities of slaveholders had to be in solidarity with one another, that they would uphold the laws of the land, right? And a similar solidarity exists aboard Matilda among the white wealthy upper deckers to keep the lower deckers apart, to act as if they don't exist, and as if these people are not responsible for producing every luxury the upper deckers enjoy. The only thing that is a larger solidarity organized around something different, is what Aster, Theo, and Giselle bring about, right? The only thing that can sort of topple hierarchies, the whole point of, the sovereigns and lieutenant, even before and after he becomes sovereign, is to sort of keep everybody in silos, and only sort of a kind of directed solidarity is what can break that. Okay, so last thing I'm going to say, so we have some time to talk. One of the main points that I tried to make, and I think I did a probably not a great job of this in my dissertation, but I'm trying to do a better job of it in things that I'm writing currently, is that, in texts that move Black characters to futuristic or parallel timelines, Black American authors are responding to the perpetuation of what C.D. Hartman calls the afterlife of slavery. Hartman writes that Black lives, this is a quote, are still imperiled and devalued by racial calculus and a political arithmetic that were entrenched centuries ago. This is the afterlife of slavery: skewed life chances, limited access to health and education, premature death, incarceration, and impoverishment, end quote. And so one of the main things that I wanted to use this book to think about is, well, one of the questions actually that people often ask when we talk about futuristic texts, and sometimes in the way they are sometimes dystopian, et cetera, is like, so what is it that Black people, Black authors want from the future? And in my work, I always argue that what the Afrofuture is supposed to look like is getting beyond the afterlives of slavery. And the question for, I think, a lot of Black writers, Black creatives of any kind, right, is that possible, right? And in my work, I argue that to do that, you have to destroy the hierarchy that separates people into like capital H humans and non-humans, right? That hierarchy, that social hierarchy that we've used to sort of set up all of our society, that bleeds into all our institutions, has to be destroyed. The problem is, that's not going to be easy. And as we meet, these characters at the beginning of An Unkindness of Ghosts, they haven't managed it yet. It's been over 300 years and they have regressed more than they have progressed, right? But by the end, there is hope because they've managed to start literally destroying the society that is set up on that premise. And I think about xenogenesis often as well, in that has to happen as well. Like the aliens straight up tell us the way who you were and the way you used to be, you will not be able to be that in the future. And as traumatic as that is for the humans that exist in that moment, there's some truth to that. But what I always argue about in that book, in that series, that the aliens don't realize that we're a mirror for them, and that the way that they are, they will also not be able to be in the future as well, right? Okay. Let's see, is there anything else to say? Yeah, so as kind of wrapping this up, right? I think that in An Unkindness of Ghosts, Solomon gives us some answers, as it relates to the vision of the future, this particular vision of the future. There is a moment in time in which we move beyond the afterlives of slavery. We don't get it to the very end of the book. I think, somebody in my Zoom group was talking about how we don't get closure, and that's okay. We get a little bit. I mean, I know I'm not the only one who wanted, about 20 more pages, Rivers. You could have gave us 20 more pages, you know what I'm saying? But part of the problem, of course, is that it takes, so much violence, so many years, so many lives, right? But there's some deep-seated truth in the fact that, human society will insist on regressing before we progress. And I think, one of the deep-seated fears of this 21st century moment is that we will destroy ourselves before we can do better. But I think the end of An Unkindness of Ghosts really, really makes the point that we can do better. We just have to live long enough to do so. All right, I'm going to stop there. So we got time for some questions before lunch.
Thank you, Regina. Thank you for that. So yes, we've got about 10 minutes for questions. I want to start with you all on Zoom first. Is there anyone who wants to ask a question?
Questions in the chat. I'm not seeing questions. I'm seeing comments.
Read some of them so that we can also feel them.
Yeah. So from Nadim, just I think resonating with the slave narrative, making reference to the chain gangs in Southern prisons, and bringing up Rudyard Kipling's famous poem, The White Man's Burden, published in 1899, during a high tide of British and American rhetoric about bringing the blessings of civilization and progress to barbaric, non-Western, non-Christian, non-white peoples. And in his often quoted phrase, this noble mission required willingness to engage in savage wars of peace, is the bit added.
Which is so great, right? Because then you think of like Lord of the Flies, where the whole point of that book is the fact that the British have to be honest about the fact that these supposedly well-raised British boys can become completely feral. And it's not like, there's a surface reading, right? Like that it's, in lieu of society. But I think all the adults and the way that everybody reacts at the end lets you know, it's like, no, this is a cause of society, right? This is like them replaying and reinscribing the things they learned as a part of proper society that makes them do all of these violent and ridiculous things to each other, ending in death of my boo Piggy. I will never get over that. They really shouldn't let 8th graders read that, like damaged forever.
Regina, we've got a question here
Okay.
in person.
Thank you for leading us on this path. I'm interested in something that Rivers actually sort of finished with. Is knowledge important to change the world? And for example, Astor's knowledge of why the lieutenant and her mother were sick because of exposure to, I suppose, radiation,
Yeah.
helped her understand and then make a change and figure it all out.
Yeah, I mean, yes. I think knowledge is really important, right? But I also think that that's why knowledge is often withheld, right? Like I live in Kentucky, but I'm from Florida, so that just tells you all you need to know, right? And as you know, books are banned, and professional colleagues of mine are, very concerned, especially the ones that like teach what I teach, right? And in a state that seems to be sort of writing the playbook of, you know, how you link your fascism to keeping knowledge from education, separating knowledge and education in a sense, right? Knowledge is always important, you know. And I think that Rivers does not give themselves enough credit for saving the world, right? Being a political writer is one way to save the world. And so yes, I would say that, knowledge is something that we should be fighting tooth and nail to make sure that everybody has access to.
Zoom folks, get ready if you have another question.
Renee, I see your hand. If you'd like to come off mute and ask your question.
Much appreciated. Thank you for all the sharing, all the deliciousness that's happened. I'm slowly processing, and my question has very little to do with all of the beautiful technical work that y'all have done. And it's
Let's go off script. Let's do it.
a super personal question. As an almost 40-year-old Black queer femme who is choosing not to have children for lots of reasons, most of them connected to violence, I am really curious what excites you about becoming a parent.
Let's talk about this, because I am on the brink. Like Rivers has, children who walk around and talk. I'm still incubating this little person. And I think that I had some of those similar feelings too for a while. But I wanted an opportunity. At least there's a part of me that's probably a little narcissistic, and I want an opportunity to, raise someone who will maybe change the world. The personal is political, and I think that part of the way that I'm choosing to, personalize my politics in this moment is believing and hoping for the better. And hoping that I can make the world a better place for this child, but also that this child will have an opportunity to make the world a better place too, right? That, that they will, be part of the solution and not continue to sort of like crack this rock open from the inside. So that's my answer. Is Rivers near a mic? Does Rivers want to chime in on this?
I think for me, like the most revolutionary thing that I can do personally is like live the life that I want to live, like sort of regardless of sort of these forces trying to sort of reign sort of death and violence. I've always wanted kids. I don't know, I experienced so much pain growing up, but I look back at my family and see so much love and beauty. And it's so exciting to me to be able to also have that love and beauty still with my kids. And I will say it's been incredibly healing for me. I don't think it's like that for everyone actually though. And we do live in a world that's really hostile to children and to so many things. What is it not hostile to? Hostile to life, period. But I'm excited to be able to like let them be, and they're just sort of radical aliveness. They can't take it away from me, the world. But I think it's also okay to not have that, to make that choice. We all get to, as much as we can, live the lives that we want to live. Yeah.
I gotta stop talking before Rivers talks. You know what I'm saying? Like they really, they really make it sound better. They're, you know.
Your answer was good too, Regina. We've got one question here.
You know, I was interested in your talk and thinking back or thinking about science fiction and so the concept of racism and slavery in our country. And you know, it's called Our Original Sin, right? And how, you know, is there a promised land, the promised land, or you know, an individual promised land, and sort of the themes of religion and expiation of sin running through the book or running through the fiction.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think a lot of part of like the book that I'm writing right now is about basically like how Black authors conceptualize the future and the Black futures. This is partially will answer your question too, Nadine, in sort of like an expansion of like, you know, the Afro future. And it changes, you know, as the present changes, the future that people can conceptualize also changes, right? And you know, often, especially early 20th century, there was a big space element to that, right? There was like, hidden cities in Africa, and and going underground, and so all of these things, right? And I think that we today, after the post space race, I think there's an element of like outer space race, of Blackness going to space that is doing some of the work now that authors were doing back then. But there's always like governmental and social and economic things that are tied to this too. And so yeah, the Afrofuture is kind of, as it always has been, a space of freedom, and very familiar to what Rivers just said, a place where Black people can live the lives that they want, truly, freely. And, there is no space that exists for that really yet. And so this also gets to Z's question, which was like, how do you see the end of this book as hopeful at all, right? And I feel you on that. But I see it as hopeful, right? Because the earth is a new space. It is a new place. It has been reborn. And I think that the people who return to it will have to be, they already started that, right? There's been a whole uprising. The sovereign is dead. Like there's been all these sort of like cross-cultural, cross-class, cross-race solidarities that have taken place, and they're ready. And so like, Aster on, the little shuttle was able to move a little faster, but they're coming. I mean, Theo and everybody else, the Matilda is coming at light speed back toward Earth, right? And so, I don't think they won't be there alone forever, right? Which I think is also hopeful. But I also think that, like, this idea of rebirth, of being able to be different and allowing the earth to heal from whatever it is we did to it, I think is always like thematically related to the healing that needs to take place within us as a species as well. So again, like I told Rivers, we could have, you could have slid us another like 10, 15 pages, you know what I'm saying? But based on what we have, right? And sort of being able to bury both Giselle and her mother in the ground of what I like to call New Earth, right? Accomplishing all kinds of goals for both those people and for Aster herself, I think is really powerful. Now, am I very afraid of birds who don't know how to be fearful of human beings? Yes. But other than that, I think that there's some room for hope here.
Thank you, Regina.